Hello and welcome to another episode of CRT Sound System. My name is Tom, here as always with Reese. Reese, how are
Hi,
you?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. And we're going to talk about fucking Chrono Cross. Um,
What?
yeah, this is one I wanted to do for so long. This is one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. Just to sort of set the scene straight away. But we've got a guest with us, Kole Ross. Kole, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Cole. Might know me from the Watch Out for Fireballs podcast. Tom and Reese were kind enough to invite me on, and I
Yeah,
also consider Chrono Cross to be one of my favorite soundtracks.
incredible. Yeah,
Awesome.
it's a real sort of a bucket list episode for me. Definitely, when I first started getting into video game music, like this is one of the ones where I was like, "Oh fuck!"
Mhm.
Yeah, just for anybody who might not know what Chrono Cross is, Cole, if you wouldn't mind just giving a quick rundown and maybe then telling us a little bit about your history with the game.
Yeah, this is the much maligned, very much unfinished sequel to the SNES classic RPG Chrono Trigger. The soundtrack composed by Yasunori Mitsuda, who did a few tracks on the Chrono Trigger soundtrack. Yeah, this is you're playing as a young boy named Serge who discovers that there's an alternate dimension where he is dead and can move between them.
Mm,
And you're listening to a lot of just extremely, I don't know, just atmospheric and
mm.
lush sounds along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, yeah, worth noting straight off the bat that this is not quite a sequel, but certainly continuing on from Chrono Trigger. Um, it's a weird one, and as you said, in many ways quite maligned, just because um, it was too much of a sequel in some ways and not enough of a sequel in others, and it found itself in this weird limbo space in between.
Yeah, the ways in which it relates to Chrono Trigger are there,
Mm,
and fascinating in the ways that it is playing
yeah,
in a a lot of things that are incredibly oversaturated and overdone today in terms of like multiverse stuff.
yeah. I was thinking
Um,
that. Yeah, the multiverse stuff, like in the '90s, nobody was doing it, but now it's just like it's in the air.
Yeah, but just like talking about, okay, we're doing all this time travel. What happens to the stuff that is, that was supposed to happen but never did because of the time
Yeah.
travel, right? And the tragedy inherent in that. Incredibly
Mm.
cool ideas, very poorly expressed through a lot of exposition, occasionally tinged by weird accents that were put over the dialogue because there are 43 characters and they had to procedurally generate it.
It's so
Yeah, the
disappointing. Gamers had not watched the movie Sliding Doors and were not prepared for this
Mm,
idea.
yeah.
yeah. Reese, what's we were talking a little bit about it, sort of in the green room beforehand, about how you've had this game but you've never really played it.
Yeah, it was the sort of thing where I bought it right when it came out, and unfortunately for me, it it was I just didn't get around to it. I played it,
Mm,
and it was just like, oh, this looks cool, but it didn't grab me. It was just like, oh, this is not, it's not like I was against it, but I was just like I was expecting something a little bit more Chrono Triggery, and so I just loaned it to a friend of mine. And then for just like 2 years of college, it was like passed around. So I
Mm.
am the cause of like 9 people at Emerson College playing Chrono Cross, but I haven't played it myself. And I only sort of know about the story and stuff. But
yeah.
I have listened to the soundtrack. It's one that's come up comes up whenever you put on any sort of like RPG music compilations or whatever.
Mm,
Especially that first track is one that I hear a lot, and I've heard some discourse about the battle song, but I'm
Yeah.
here to sit down and listen and learn more than anything. I'm excited.
Another learning episode for Reese, though.
Exactly.
Yeah, and for myself, as mentioned many times, a lot of these games never came to Ireland. So Chrono Trigger never actually came out here specifically, which always annoyed me because it was something you would see previewed in a lot of like gaming magazines back in the day, and I would be poring over screenshots and previews and stuff, and they were like, "Yeah, the game's coming. Don't worry, this game is coming out here," and the game just never fucking came out. And I was always so disappointed. So discovering that once I discovered that emulation existed, I was like, okay, fucking time to sit down and play Chrono Trigger. And I wasn't disappointed. I love that game. I don't think it maybe holds up as well anymore, but I do think that there's a lot of stuff that it does really, really interestingly. But then a friend of mine, Damien, who I've probably mentioned on the podcast before, he was really into importing, and he had a copy of this game, and he was like, "Oh, you like Chrono Trigger? Did you know that they made a sequel?" And I was like, "I didn't, but I'm interested." So I didn't have any way to play PlayStation games. So again, as I was telling Reese beforehand, I did have a PC that could emulate PlayStation and a disc burner. So I borrowed his copy of the game and made a copy of the disc and used that to play it through EPSXE. And that was basically how I played that game for the first time, and a magical experience, I gotta say. Definitely not as much as Chrono Trigger, but I have a huge amount of affection for this game, and in no small part because of the soundtrack.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's.
No.
I think genuinely, it might be Mitsuda's masterpiece. Like it's really hard to fault any of the music in it, except for we'll maybe talk about the battle theme.
Yeah, the one song you hear more than anything.
Yeah, and that sort of speaks to, I think, maybe some of the problems with the game as a whole as well. But yeah, so one thing I do want to mention before I suppose we go on as well is like you did mention that Mitsuda did work on the Chrono Trigger soundtrack as well, and basically burned himself out on it to the point that he sent himself to hospital. Because it was like his first big break as like a composer. So I'm glad that this didn't happen with this soundtrack. Because right. I think it comes out a lot better for the fact that he was able to sort of have that space to explore sounds and and I think it's worth mentioning as well, like a lot of Celtic music influences in this. Like a lot of RPG music is you got your standard prog influences, but I think Mitsuda was one of the first people to start bringing in proper Celtic instrumentation and Celtic songwriting techniques into it, which may be of no interest to either of you, but as an Irish person, it is certainly something that I found really, really fascinating at the time.
It's it's funny because I have a strong association between RPG music and Celtic music because way back in the mid 90s, there was an album of songs from the Final Fantasy IV soundtrack,
Celtic Moon.
done Celtic Moon, yeah. And I saw it in a magazine ad, and I was like, "Mom, you have to help me import this." I must have been like, I don't know, 8 years old or something like that, and just like here I am. Okay. Listening to Celtic versions of RPG music and stuff. So like that had already been so, I don't know, just burned into my head by the time I listened to this, that it just felt like a natural extension.
Yeah. Well, Maura Bernach, who actually is it was part of the group of people who ended up doing the arrangements for Celtic Moon, is a friend of my cousin's.
Oh wow!
So I have some cousins who are sort of in the Irish traditional music scene as such. So like a lot of the people who get involved with Celtic Moon and later with Xenogears and with the Radical Dreamers version, which we might talk about a bit later, which does have some new music written by some Irish musicians and composers. like it's a very small scene, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
So like I know some of these people sort of third hand, and one day I'd really want to sit some of them down and maybe do like an interview with them about sort of the influence of Celtic music on RPGs and in Japan. I've actually mentioned a group called Kele before on the podcast, who are like a traditional Irish band that have a bit of an Afrobeat sound going to them, but they've also worked with Ainu musicians from the north of Japan. To do, they did like a whole album of music based on monkey magic, and what's the name of that story? That like the Dragon Ball Z is based on.
Oh yeah, Journey to the West.
Journey to the West, yeah. So they did like a whole soundtrack with some Ainu musicians. That was all like based around that. So like there is a history of like Japanese musicians and Irish musicians sort of crossing over. And it's something I'd definitely love to delve deeper on and speak to some people on it. But that's maybe something for when I have a bit more time to myself to do a big project like that about. But yeah, what we'll do, so I think we're going to jump into the first block of tracks, and then maybe we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the game and the sort of just the generalities of the game. So the first 4 tracks I have are Arni Village Home, Termina Another, Galdov Home, and Galdov Another, and we'll talk about the sort of the home and the another differences maybe in the next block, just because it sort of speaks to the more interesting part of the game itself.
I have an anecdote about this music. I know
Oh yeah,
we
no,
were at
go ahead.
the
Jump
break
right
here.
in.
Yeah, so my first job out of college was a part-time job working at a radio station. That
Mm.
was it was called a radio reading service. So it's a radio station that does reading for the blind and visually impaired. So
Okay.
people in around Cincinnati, which was the city I was living in at the time, that who were clients of this agency would get special radios tuned to a to a frequency that nobody else could get, where people would be reading newspapers, magazines,
Mm.
sometimes novels, things like that. It was a really rewarding job because primarily worked with volunteers, which was neat.
Oh, that's cool.
But we had to do, as the recording engineer, I was responsible for doing the, in between shows, introduction and schedule read and reading the weather and
Oh,
stuff.
okay.
And we had full control over the music we would play behind that, as we'd say, like, oh, it is 2 p.m. and here's what's coming up next, blah blah blah. And so I grew tired of the music that they had, just the stock music for it.
That's the library
And
music, yeah.
yeah, just library music, yeah. So I burned my own I burned my own CD, mostly with video game music. But just instrumental, and either tracks directly off of the Chrono Cross soundtrack, or some OC remix tracks as well.
Hell yes.
Yeah.
Awesome.
would would be kind of the sound bed over which I would play that. And I guarantee, because they never cleaned that place out when I was there, that CD is probably still there. That
Wow.
is my legacy,
I
laundering.
really hope that there's people using that music as part of like announcements that do not know where it came from
Yup.
to this day.
Did you
Yeah.
ever get any feedback? Just people just being like, "Oh, this seems like a legendary soundtrack across time and space instead of just the weather."
No, it
Like,
wasn't.
oh,
And we never heard anything back about it. But that does lead to something, which is, that first set of tracks. I would feel a little bit ridiculous sitting down and saying to somebody, "This is one of the best video game soundtracks of all time." Because
mhm,
when you think of video game soundtrack, especially with modern things,
Mm,
it's really bombastic. It's cinematic or what have you. And to sit
yeah.
down and say that, like, no, this pure moods ass music was fucking mind blowing. And conjures up all of these warm feelings. It takes a lot more
Mm,
justification than to hit somebody with something that is immediately more impressive, right?
mhm.
yeah.
You know,
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, there's no shortage of that in this soundtrack as well.
yeah.
But like, yeah, that's the the start of the game where you're sort of, like a lot of RPGs, you start in this sort of pastoral hometown. Like, in this case, it's more of a beachside town, but the idea remains the same. Like, but the the fact that it sounds like somebody is just sitting on the dock for that first track, say the Arni Village one, like just somebody
Mhm.
sitting on the dock just playing a guitar. And
Hmm.
you mentioned sort of straight off the bat, Cole, just that like you can hear the fingers scraping on the guitar strings, like that it is. There's like a warmth and humanity to it that like you're not going to get with synthesized music. And you sort of and that you lose then by going too far in the other direction of just having a big bombastic 80-piece orchestra play a piece of music as well.
Yeah.
Like there's a humanity to it. There's a sort of a person, a personality to it that like you really can't get around, and it really gives the early such a nice warm feeling. Like it really does at a lot of times just feel like being just wrapped in a blanket.
Hmm.
There's
And it's
definitely a cozy feel.
it's funny with the concept of the game, which is,
Mm,
one world in which, your life is as you knew it, and in the other,
mm,
the other world, the only difference, kind of the divergence point, is that you are dead. It's
yeah.
it's it's neat how it plays with that, because in your world, of course, this feels and sounds like home. It's calm. And you go into the other world, and it's not like crazy dissimilar. A different game, a
Mm,
different kind of story would have it be like,
disconcerting.
yeah, like eerie, and
Yeah.
maybe a little bit of that little bit of that seeps in there, but like broadly, visually, the two worlds are the same because this one
Mm,
person, the way that their death affects things is more subtle. So you get to this other
yeah.
world, and nobody is mourning you aside from a
Mm,
handful of people who for whom your death is this thing that happened 16 years ago and they've moved past. Like
yeah.
this is still home for them.
Yeah. And then like to contrast that, like say the second track, the Another Termina, like that's one of the first major towns you go to after you leave, and after you sort of get transported to the other world, and like it's a sort of a party. Like there's really like everybody seems to be having a good time, and you contrast that with the home version of Termina, which is like under military rule,
Yeah.
and is a lot more sort of dark in tone and everything. And like you would, I think a lesser game would take the idea of the worst world being the one that you're sort of the one that you weren't in.
Hmm.
But like in this one there are bad things and good things in both versions of the world. And I suppose to maybe explain a little bit about what that is, because we've maybe sort of danced around it a little bit, but like the entire premise of the game, as Cole mentioned, is that like there is a divergence point in reality where your main character either died or didn't die, and that causes sort of a split in reality that wasn't supposed to happen. And like the game itself then sort of deals with sort of what are the consequences of like the timelines that we never sort of lived. And like the you to go back then to Chrono Trigger, like the way this connects to Chrono Trigger is sort of circuitously through these sort of timelines that got sort of pruned off by your actions in Chrono Trigger, went to another dimension essentially, and are trying to fight their way back to reality.
Yeah.
It's a kind of it's pretty wild. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. No, it's the Darkness Beyond Time, which I think is the
Mm,
name of one of the tracks.
yeah.
Yeah. And when we say like, oh, stuff that you did, how are we on spoilers on this? It's a 25-year-old
I'd
game.
say we tend to not bother with spoilers,
Gotcha. Okay.
so go hog wild.
I didn't want to be inconsiderate, but like,
Mm,
it incorporates kind of kind of everything that would have, that would have happened in the in Chrono Trigger up to and
mm,
including like, when you go back in time and, stop the dinosaurs, like stop the lizard people
yeah.
in the prehistoric era from, forestalling their own kind of catastrophe. Like,
Yeah.
they still end up being able to reassert themselves on the timeline. you know
Mm,
yeah, just like the way that, you get a glimpse of the far future in the world of the good endings, right? The ones that
mm,
completely avoid all of the disaster that you see in the year 2300 in there,
yeah.
and see how they still manage to mess it up by understanding that, by gaining this understanding of being able to manipulate timelines, right?
Hmm. And there is even a sort of a suggestion that like the timeline of where the reptiles were the sort of predominant species on the planet was actually the correct timeline,
Hmm.
and you fucked it up by doing by
Yeah.
sort of by stopping them from sort of being able to prevent their own destruction.
Yeah.
Which is a really really interesting concept, and it the game doesn't really do a great job of explaining that,
It,
which is part of the problem, I think, with how people sort of reacted to it.
yeah, a lot of the information that we convey is either, that we just related there, is either conveyed in the environments of where you go
Mm,
to, some horrifying news about something that happened to a character that you loved in Chrono Trigger,
mm,
or in a monologue that happens on a beach on the second disc, right before the game ends. They just like, all right, this is the stuff we would have said otherwise if we could finish the game. Let's just
yeah,
put it in the mouths of these characters and then go and fight Lavos again. Have fun.
yeah. No, it's definitely it's playing with some much more, I think, interesting ideas than Chrono Trigger does. Because Chrono Trigger, I think, executes on those its ideas a lot better. But you can only have so many grandfather paradoxes before I'm like, okay, well, let's keep it going. There's a lot of really good stuff in Chrono Trigger, but it doesn't it doesn't feel like it's ever sort of reaching beyond its grasp.
It's a very childish story, which you can control destiny. Something that I think a lot of people really don't like about Chrono Cross is the fact that, depending on choices that you make, certain characters that you might want are mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Like this is a game where destiny controls you and you don't get a chance to get everything you want. Nothing is escapable.
Yeah. And it's like one of the best characters behind in the game is locked behind you, having to make a really difficult choice.
Yeah,
and like it's a genuinely difficult choice because it basically involves you just ignoring a character that the game is like, this is an important character. You need to have this character with you, and you have to be a complete piece of shit and just ignore them.
I heard of people being mad about that. For sure. When I was reading about this.
It should be something that makes you mad, but it's also the game is like, look, you gotta make some bad choices sometimes if you want.
Yeah.
And like the game ultimately still lets you sort of go on with that character, but like it does make you feel bad about it.
Yeah. It sets her up as the romantic interest. We're talking about Kid.
Yeah, and it's the other character then is Glenn, who's sort of like the frog analog. I feel like they sort of went back and forth on whether he was in fact frog or not.
Same thing with what's his name, Gale.
With Gale,
implied to be. Straight up implied by one of the endings in the remake, the DS remake of Chrono Cross, Chrono Trigger, implied to be Magus, but with amnesia.
Mm-hmm. And I think then the Radical Dreamers edition does add some stuff to that I, as far as I'm aware, in terms of adding to the confusion into that mix.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose mentioning the characters as well, so that I think one of the things that is notable about this game is the amount of characters, and is also one of its biggest downfalls in a lot of ways. It's like, but it also plays then into the sort of leveling system, which I do think is an interesting way to get around having that many characters.
Yes.
Because it's like 43 characters in total, is it?
I just looked it up. It's 45 playable
45,
characters.
Yeah. Which for an RPG is, you usually maybe have 8 in a game with a big party.
How can you make any one of them matter more than the other when there are so many? And when it runs the gamut between like, oh, here's your main character and your fated love interest or whatever, down to here's a dog who talks with a lisp, and here's a clown skeleton.
Yeah. we love the clown skeleton, but not exactly a compelling character. And as you mentioned previously as well, like one of the things I don't know if they did it if this was in the Japanese version, if it was just done for the English translation, but they sort of procedurally generated accents for every single character. Which seems like entirely too much work, to be honest. But it does sort of give the characters some bit of sort of differentiation in terms of dialogue, because obviously if you arrive to any given place where there's a piece where there's dialogue or where there's just cutscenes happening, like these characters do have to interact with what's happening. So if they just had the exact same dialogue, I could imagine that just being a little bit sort of disappointing if you were trying out different characters. So just giving some people a little bit of a different accent does it's an interesting idea, but it doesn't necessarily work.
It's a novel solution to a problem that they created for themselves by including all of those characters.
Yeah. And it's a game that I think you could probably pare it down to like 20 characters, and still, like, a lot of those characters could be interesting in their own right.
Yeah.
But like, what do you really need with the alien? the weird sort of Pikachu character that you find in a dungeon,
Yep.
who's been experimented on. Like there's
Oh, this game
some of
has
these sound like
everything.
jokes. Yeah, it's a weird game.
Clown
And like
skeleton, Pikachu. How have I not played this?
Because not very many people like it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's such it's a really really interesting game in so many ways, and like its flaws are part of why I love it though as well to a degree. It's just
Yeah.
the fact that they're just like, fuck it, we're just gonna include all this shit, and like there's absolutely no way you can get all these characters in one playthrough.
Mhm.
And for that reason, it does include a new game plus, very similar to the way Chrono Trigger does it. Um, but it does allow you to just then go back and make some different choices, and you can be an asshole to Kid if you want, and then go and get Glenn.
All right, one question before we move on to the next tracks.
Yeah.
What so this game has a lot of characters. Is it just like you have one big party and they sleep in one big bed at the inn, or is there like a camp or something, that where everybody's hanging out?
So your general party is three characters. Is usually going to be Surge, and then two others. For the most part, characters that aren't in your party don't exist. They just go probably, I guess, to the bend of time or whatever and just wait around. But you can, some characters when they're not in your party will just be like hanging out at their house, or there's like an island where like a bunch there's like a faction of characters called I forget the name of them, but it's like Karsh and the Marcy, the weird child soldier.
Yeah.
And like there's like a bunch of
Unlike the normal child soldiers.
no, she's like an anime child soldier where she just
Okay.
yeah, and does she use a yo-yo to fight? I'm trying to remember.
I forget.
Yeah, I never use her. But there's a
So-
bunch of
so you
characters
can-
who are sort of all aligned, and there's
So you
an
can
island
freely
that they all
choose
hang
the
out.
other two characters,
Pretty much, yeah.
or okay, that's kind of what I'm curious. How do you
Yeah,
interact?
and it does mean that there are certain characters who you will want to bring along for certain quests, and you might get extra dialogue in certain cutscenes, or you might be able to get extra information by bringing certain characters along to certain places on the map. But the game doesn't always signal that to you. In fact, it almost never signals that to you. So like sometimes there's a bit of guesswork involved in like maybe finding out a bit more information to be like, who should I bring for this quest? But that's again, that brings you back to the so you did mention it during the break that one of the complaints you've often heard of it is the leveling system. So basically how leveling works in the game is you get stars for each boss that you beat. And that's your level for the entire party. So everybody in your party has however many stars that you've collected. But getting into battles after boss fights does give you some minor stat boosts. So like your active party does get a little bit of a boost, but it's not that much of a big deal. But it also just means that like you can pretty much just swap anyone out at any time. You're never going to find that like a random character that you haven't used for 20 hours is massively under level compared to the rest of the party. So like
so you're able to kind of just to experiment. You have room
Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even though if you might not enjoy the fact that you have to get through this dungeon, and every encounter is only giving you minor boosts, you're still able to be like, well, I'm gonna bring the clown skeleton and Pikachu with me and see how they play. All right, that makes sense.
It's not entirely dissimilar from Final Fantasy VII, where each of the characters is roughly interchangeable except for their limit breaks. And your stats are more your materia. In this, like the bosses that you have, it's kind of a linear progression up through strength that you have. But where you can actually jump the curve is by exploring and finding crafting materials to go to a blacksmith and make better versions of the gear that they have.
Okay.
Yeah, and different characters use different classes of weapons, so that's how you kind of swap out by roles.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. But as I say, it's an inelegant solution to a problem they created themselves. But for what it's worth, I do think it's an interesting sort of concept, definitely.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think with that we'll jump into the next block of tracks. So I have a couple of map themes here, and then the battle theme, which I think we're going to have to talk about after. So the first track I have is the Homeworld map, is the Plains of Time. Second track is the Another World map, At the Shore of Dreams. Then this is the El Nido Triangle map, is called Chronomantique. And then the last track is Gale, which is the battle theme. definitely Yasunori Mitsuda in his prog era with that with that battle theme.
It sticks out like a sore thumb compared to all the other tracks because it is the one that sounds the most video gamey.
It
I don't
does,
know if it's
and
because of that prog element as well, but like the actual like quality of the sound
the
too.
organ. Like there's that organ in there that I think is sort of like, it does. It does sort of stand out a bit. But I think if you go and listen to like the Shadow Hearts soundtracks, which he did a couple of the battle themes for, you'll see that he does sort of he does come back to this style of battle theme quite a bit in those soundtracks as well, to maybe a slightly better effect. Just because Shadow Hearts just has that general unsettling vibe to it, that doesn't necessarily work to the benefit of Chrono Cross. You know, because the battle system is something we haven't really talked about. It is reasonably straightforward in terms of just like you have your guys lined up on one side and your enemies lined up on the other side, but then like the mechanics of the battles themselves are a little bit sort of difficult to sort of get into, I would say. It definitely took me towards the end of my first playthrough before I really thought I was like getting what was going on in it, in terms of like the stamina management and the element meters and the like the percentages and like what affected those percentages.
This
like,
is the game with like the field stuff, like the
Yes.
environment is plays a part.
The,
Okay, I didn't understand any of that.
it's not so much about the environment, it's just that it's keeping track of the element of the spells that have
the
been
spells
cast.
that you cast,
Yeah, they're called elements, which is
Yeah.
confusing, but they're all assigned a color, and if the last three spells that have been cast are like of the same color, then you can do special stuff. Like that's how you use your summons. It powers things up, and every character has their own innate element. Yeah.
And to that as well, your items also are sort of part of that same, like your consumable items. So like if you want to just use like a basic potion type item, you know, that's like a green or whatever. It doesn't really matter, but you know, it's one color. And then your spells are all sort of all part of this same grid of spells that you have access to that you can sort of customize, and then each character has their own sort of individual techniques, similar to Chrono Trigger, and the game does also have double and triple text that Chrono Trigger had, but to much less of a they're much less important to the actual battle system, I found. It's there's a lot going on, and as I mentioned as well, there's a stamina meter that you need to manage when you're doing your physical attacks and your element attacks. Your physical attacks, you see the percentage of your accuracy, and you can select 3 different strengths from a menu. With like varying accuracies and stuff like that, and then actually landing attacks affects the level of elements that you can then use. You know, everything is constantly sort of shifting. It can be really, really difficult to keep track of everything, and I think maybe that combined with the sort of the frantic nature of the battle system or the battle theme probably puts people on edge.
Yeah. The thing that is most unsettling to me about the battle theme in that is that the phrasing in it, I do not know the word to describe it. It is not like anything else, just with with the varying lengths of those violin runs that are, that are going on. Like it feels especially breathless because it just that they every single note, you have no idea how long it's going to be held.
And it's like the time signature is so sort of lurching, and like sometimes it ends earlier than you anticipate it will, and sometimes it ends a little bit later than you anticipate it will. You know, so it never sort of lets you settle into a groove. You know, as I say, that seems deliberate, but also I can understand why that is something that people would be turned off by. But I do think it's a really really cool piece of music just in and of itself.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me too, at least sort of my more outsiders looking in through this episode, is that Mitsuda in his interviews talks about before he wanted to be anything else, he was a film brother, and so he's talking about sort of like all of these like old Italian films and stuff that he would watch in kind of preparation for becoming a filmmaker. And then he switched over to music after, uh, you know, falling in love with soundtracks. And to me, it feels the battle theme feels very cinematic in the sense that it's something I would imagine in like a old school 70s 80s horror film, or maybe a more kind of like niche sort of like foreign action film, foreign for us,
Hmm.
where it's just like the violence is beginning, and so you have these like discordant, difficult time signature moments that are supposed to set you on edge. And it's sort of like this, it's the sort of thing you would imagine for a final boss theme in I would say other RPGs, but in this it feels, at least in my mind's eye, it feels right for sort of the vibe that it's going for, where it's just sort of like all the music we've listened to up until this moment has meant to perfectly encapsulate whatever vibe you're in at the time, whether it be the menu music, the opening music. And it's clearly supposed to be kind of like listened to as its own piece as well. But it must, especially because you're listening to the battle theme so much, this must be just like very jarring, and you've got all of this stuff that you've got to manage on top of it with the what honestly sound like stressful mechanics, or at the very least mechanics that you have very little control over unless you read a guide or you've played the game quite a bit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I just imagine it as being like everybody, like just to agree that everybody kind of got set on edge and then decided they didn't like it, despite the fact it's an excellent piece of music, just because of how it made them feel, which was upset.
I also don't know that that keening violin was the necessarily the best choice to be made for a piece of music you hear so often. I think
Hmm.
there's also
Mhm.
just like a little bit of, I don't know what the music equivalent of misophonia is, but I think is especially piercing, I guess.
Mm. It does really really cuts through the soundscape on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but to speak, I suppose, a bit more of music that is more beloved. The first three tracks there, just all of them having sort of elements of Corridors of Time, which is like the original Chrono Trigger theme. And
Hmm.
it's something that sort of comes up as a leitmotif throughout the whole soundtrack. There's a lot more tracks. Like this is a 3 disc soundtrack. It's pretty big, and you do get that theme sort of repeated a lot through it. And it's always nice to hear it come back.
Yeah. The specifically the Another World theme, it's
Mm,
tied for being my favorite track on here,
yeah,
specifically because it is tinged with just enough melancholy.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I don't know. It is lyrical in a way that like reminds me of some of the best off of the Chrono Trigger soundtrack. Like it feels wind songy to me.
yeah, absolutely, yeah, and yeah, it's I think because like we talked about the Another World stuff where it's not always going to be sort of like the worst version or the sad version of the world, but I think when you first enter this world and that's sort of the song that you hear first, like there's definitely a sense of like of loss to it.
Hmm.
Because you go from the plains of time, which is it's a little it's more tropical. The vibe is definitely a little bit more upbeat. You've got those tuned percussion or the strings. We were trying to figure out whether it was steel drums or some other type of instrument that is actually used in it. It's quite difficult to tell, but in either case, it does feel a lot more sort of up tempo, upbeat, and sort of
Yeah.
hopeful, whereas you go to the Shore Dreams and it's, it's not sad as such, but it's definitely it's tinged with a melancholy that is hard to grasp. And I think that sort of it works really well thematically with sort of where your character's head is going to be and where you are when you're sort of like when you get to this new world and you're like, wait, what the fuck is happening?
Yeah.
I'll go ahead.
Oh no, no, I was gonna go on to something not strictly related to what you were talking
Go ahead.
about.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I was just going to bring in like a little like trivia, Snapple fact kind of thing. There's a musical connection between the idea of the many worlds theory and just music in general. The originator of the many worlds theory, Hugh Everett, his son, Mark Everett, is the like lead member of the Eels indie rock
Oh,
band. Yeah, that's
Really?
yeah. That's same guy. There was a BBC documentary, just just looking at that connection between the two of them, and you know the many worlds theory and what Hugh Everett was doing, and how that
wow.
kind of informed E's music. Yeah,
That's
literally
fascinating.
related to
Okay.
nothing. The only reason I bring it up is because I was heavily into the Eels and Chrono Cross at the same time.
Yeah,
The year
that
was
would have been.
2000.
No, I was not. I missed Chrono Cross, but I did not miss the Eels. When I was seeing, when I was in college, that's probably when I went to shows the most, and Eels kept coming through Boston,
Mm,
and it's
Hmm.
probably one of the live bands I've seen the most. That's really
Yeah,
exciting to learn.
yeah,
awesome. Yeah,
love
no, I
that
never
band.
knew that. Yeah. Haven't thought about eels in a long, long time. I'll say I definitely had shock blues in my CD player a lot.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
They were quite big in the UK. I think they
There's
were one of those American bands that got really, really big in the UK and actually might have been bigger in the UK and Ireland than they were
oh
I would
yeah.
not be
over in the
surprised.
US.
No, they won
Yeah.
whatever your equivalent of the Grammys is, and the drummer made the statue part of his drum kit.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's definitely a cool connection. Wow.
Yeah.
And yeah, I suppose musically, the game there is sort of a connection to sort of the Chrono Trigger theme, in terms of how you beat the final boss.
Hmm.
um, so we mentioned, I suppose, with the field effect. So you if you're able to cast spells in a very specific order, um, then that allows you to sort of beat the final boss, and get to the true ending. Um, but one of the only ways the game clues you into that order is with music.
Hmm.
There's like
Oh,
it's one screen in the game where it plays a tune, and I'm pretty sure it is just the Chrono Trigger team, or maybe it's just Shala's team. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
Um, but it's just like it's 7 or 8 notes just sort of repeated, and that is the order that you're supposed to play the or supposed to cast the spells in, which
Hmm.
is easier said than done because of you're
Right.
also having to like it's bad enough in the game trying to get 3 spells of the same color cast in a row, and trying to do that while the final boss is also taking its turns.
Yeah.
Um,
It's one of the least accessible, um because one of the least accessible endings, not just because of its obscurity, but it relies both on hearing, on being able to discern tunes,
and not being colorblind.
and not be colorblind, right? So like it is one of these things where a non-trivial portion of the population is just physically unable to like get to it on their own without
Mm,
assistance,
yeah.
which is a dick move.
It is, yeah, but it is, it's interesting that they sort of tried something like that.
Yeah.
It's a pity that they weren't able to give people a way to sort of experience that without having to rely on those elements.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think so. We shall jump into the next block of tracks. So this is just sort of a bit of a mixed grill of different tracks from various parts of the game that I just wanted to make sure that we included. So the first track is the Brink of Death, which is the boss battle theme. Then we have Optimism, which I think is the salt and pepper theme, I think specifically. It's a bit of a goofy track, and I always like to include a bit of a goofy track where I can. Then we have Predicament, which is just a cutscene theme that I just really, really like. We've Isle of the Dead, which is one of the more interesting sort of zones in the game in terms of like look. And then we have Chronopolis, which is sort of the big sort of plot dump area at the end of disc 1. So a lot to talk about with Chronopolis, I think. So yeah, we'll jump into those and we'll come back and talk a bit later. Chronopolis is probably the one track I've listened to the most on this entire soundtrack. If for no other reason than it's on my sleep playlist. So like, I just stick it on every night, and that's what I fall asleep to.
Yeah, it's really funny because it's the most futuristic area of the game, right? It's what if the world of Chrono Trigger was allowed to go into the good future,
Yeah.
well beyond, and it is a place that exists outside of time, and the hack way to do it would be to make it sound, futuristic and speculative and have lots of laser sounds and pews and all of that, but it feels like a very modern like cinematic score kind of thing. While it was playing, I was joking like, oh, it sounds like Metal Gear or like Parasite Eve, but like, just like, oh, it just sounds like stuff that is kind of contemporary, meant to be set roughly near future, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I like how it incorporates. Is it Memories of Green? Is that the name of the track?
I didn't catch that.
The sort of arpeggiated synths and the
Oh
arpeggiated
yeah.
pianos in it are very similar to the Forest theme.
Okay.
Is it the I can't remember one of the themes from Chrono Trigger.
I am uniquely bad at spotting the similarity between melodies, between quotes or whatever.
Yeah. I forget I think it's Memories of Green is the name of the track on the Chrono Trigger soundtrack. But yeah, it's very similar, and I think just sort of thematically is sort of interesting. Is it's just sort of like in Chrono Trigger, that's the place where you first go when you time travel. Whereas here it's sort of like it's the place where time travel has sort of broken down and is people are trying to figure out how to actually get it to sort of to turn it into something that they can use as a force. Like the Chronopolis, as we mentioned, is sort of where you get the big end of disc one, sort of exposition dump, where you sort of find out, and like a lot of stuff is like just in like you walk up to a terminal and you get a bit of lore about Lavos or what actually happened, or you get you can find out some bits about the Radical Dreamers, which was a sort of a visual novel that was on the Super Nintendo, that this was loosely based on, and is included in the Radical Dreamers edition as a sort of an extra bonus. It's not technically canon to the extent that anything is canon in a series where time travel can exist. But there are references to that in there, and you can find out the fate of various Chrono Trigger characters in there.
And it's
just, oh, go ahead.
It's where you as Surge get to kill Robo with your own two hands.
Yeah, just to really rub that in. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, because the Robo gets sort of reconstituted into this this supercomputer called is the computer called Fate, or is
the computer is called Fate, and Robo is like a limiter, like a lock on it. It's the way it's Robo is that it's called the Prometheus lock. And Prometheus is his code name, or what, his designation, I guess.
Before you find him in the game. It's such a cool place as well, because you just sort of, it's in this sort of dead city that's sort of like frozen in time, and is sort of outside of all of the other dimensions, and like you can't even get to it from the space where you sort of started. You have to go to the other world and get transported into it. Like there's a whole quest line involved in it. It's very, very difficult for the characters to actually get in there, because it's sort of in this weird space outside of time. And you just run around and you can talk to some ghosts that are like scientists, essentially, that were sort of running these experiments, and you can sort of find out more about your own fate and why you specifically, Surge, is sort of the only person who can sort of travel between the worlds because of this sort of divergence of timelines and all this kind of stuff. it's a lot of big expedition dumping happening at this point in the game.
Yeah.
And genuinely one of my favorite parts of the game, because there's just like, they say I like that this game is so interested in like what happens to the dead timelines that we create through time travel. I think that's just such a fundamentally more interesting question, even if the execution isn't necessarily the best on it.
Yeah.
The other tracks then. Yeah, we had the Brink of Death, which we were talking about. It feels almost more like a traditional battle theme than a boss battle theme.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like it's sort of flipped with Gale in ways. It's a lot more sort of just straightforward time signatures and a lot more bombastic. And it's another great piece of music. And the other one then I really like is the Isle of the Dead. Just it's such an atmospheric piece. Like it's just really. It really gives you that sort of when you walk in and it's just like bones of dragons and zombies, and I think it's where you find the skeleton character we mentioned.
It's one of the places. I think it might be where you have to assemble him.
Assemble it from pieces of bones you find around the place. Yeah. And it's also the sort of where you get the conclusion of the quest where you have to fight Dario to defeat an evil sword that took over him.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of like the end of that side quest.
The Isle of the Dead track, the Bone Zone that we're talking about, was really interesting for me to listen to, because it's sort of reading through Mitsuda's interviews. He's very much sort of like a non-gamer sound engineer, composer type, and he talks so much about using different folk music in it, and we've talked about the Celtic influence before, but I feel like you could really hear it in that as well, where it felt like it had these sort of like Eastern sort of techniques. He said a lot. He was really influenced by Russian folk music in the Chrono Cross soundtrack, and I feel like you can hear these distinct elements. To me, it almost felt like the cliche of video game desert music, but applied to a graveyard instead. And I feel like that really speaks to his talent, that he's really able to sort of like draw from these very classic world music sources, but not make it sound like, okay, well we're in the forest, so we're gonna do some Irish stuff, and so now we're in the desert, we're gonna do some Middle Eastern stuff. He's really just creating something unique every time.
He's purposefully like bobbing and weaving around cliches.
He really is, and he was a really interesting composer to read about as well, because he's very clearly like has a real chip on his shoulder about wanting to be the best possible. He talks about like, well, my dad was a painter and I really loved painting, but I can't do what my dad does. I can't give him that W. Like, and so he talks about stuff like he was, when he was in college, the sort of like more established composers would like write him off, and he's like, I'll show you. I'll make the soundtrack for Chrono Trigger. And it seems like you can really see for everything, and I think he's been almost universally lauded. There's no one who's like, oh, this is mid Mitsuda. And so it's very interesting to see the different sort of like types develop. We've certainly seen the sort of like sound engineer music type before, but I think Mitsuda really stands out as one of the the other Squaresoft giant, as it were.
Certainly from the 90s, I think.
Yeah. From that's why I said Squaresoft, and before. But yeah, I don't know. It just really makes me respect him, and you sort of like listen to everything that he talks about, and how it's just was so involved with the Chrono Trigger soundtrack. Imagine the first thing you do out of college is something to the level of the Chrono Trigger soundtrack. It's
Yeah.
just like there are some people who just operate on other levels than me.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And yeah, made himself sick, had stomach ulcers doing it. And so yeah, I just wanted to shoehorn in the reading I did somewhere. But
Yeah.
yeah, the
It's worthwhile context for sure. He's definitely somebody who has put in the work.
Mhm.
Uh, and I don't know. I've never heard especially bad words said about him or what he's done. People can disagree about how important the Chrono Cross soundtrack is, but yeah, I had no idea. Just because I've never really looked over his whole discography. He's on the music team for Dungeon Meshi for Delicious in Dungeon, which is weird.
really.
Oh,
Yeah,
interesting.
I've never listened to or watched the anime. I've just read some of the manga, so now I might have to check that out and see if I can hear it.
Yeah, now he has his own company, and he says, that's why he said he's turned down, work from Square, where he's just like, oh, this RPG seems really interesting, but what you want from it is different from what I want in terms of the expansion of my career.
Yeah,
So it seems like he has this very sort of prestigious, almost boutique composition house. And there were pictures of it in the one interview he did. It's just like all wood with these sort of like open rafters. And he was just like, I just need to compose in a good vibe, that sort of stuff. So you get the sense that he's very sort of self-driven and operating on his own level, and it's great. It's probably we're going to be hearing from him because he's not too old of a guy, so you're probably going to
Mhm.
be hearing bangers from him for decades.
yeah,
Yeah. And certainly on this podcast, like I have a lot of his soundtracks on my shortlist.
Absolutely.
That I like. He's been involved in a lot in the Xenogears soundtrack. And then Xeno Saga and Xenoblade, going on from there. I've got a Mario Party episode planned some point in the future. He did the soundtrack for that.
that's so bizarre.
Like he's somebody that I think sort of when I mentioned that this is one of the first soundtracks that really grabbed me as something to listen to outside of the game. When I was first getting into video game music, so like Mitsuda has been somebody who's been sort of with me on my journey through video game music from pretty much the very start.
Yeah.
Genuinely one of my favorite composers of all time. But yeah, I think we can jump into the next block of tracks. So just as a bit of a precursor, so these all are from the Radical Dreamers edition, which we sort of discussed a little bit. So that was released was it 2022 or last year? I can't remember.
That was 2022. I was really frustrated because I did a stream of Chrono Cross, emulated the PlayStation version, and it was like 2 weeks after I finished the stream, they announced the remake, and it's like, well, shit, I probably would have done the remake.
Yeah. Oh, that's really that can be really frustrating. God. But yeah, it's a pretty solid remaster. There's nothing changed too much about it. So that does mean that a lot of the problems of the game, both technical and otherwise, are sort of still present. So you do sort of have to take the good with the bad in that regard. But it is a very good representation of the original game, I find. And it's nice to have the additional quality of life stuff, like just being able to avoid battles and being able to do the speed up, which was included in the original game, but only if you were playing the new game plus mode.
Yeah.
Oh,
And I
okay.
wish more games did that in general, where you could just speed it up or give you an option to do that sort of later in the game. And as I mentioned, it also includes the first official translation of Radical Dreamers, which is just like essentially a short story in video game form. I would hesitate to call it a visual novel as such, But it's sort of like a choose your own adventure. Sort of, you've got like 7 or 8 different choices you can make throughout this, and it takes about maybe 10-15 minutes to go through.
Yeah, it wasn't even a full game. It was Satellaview.
It was on the Satellaview. And it was luckily preserved, so there were fan translations of it going around for quite a while. But it's good that it's just, as a preservationist, it's good to see stuff like that just being sort of released so that people can have it, and even if it's never necessarily going to be something that is going to set the world on fire, that it just that it is there and that it is kept for the people who are interested in it is really, really good to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as for the music, so they mostly the music was more or less untouched, I think, with some slight remastering, but there were a couple of different tracks that were rearranged for a special CD release, and a couple of new tracks added with music by a musical group from Ireland called Anunia, and they have worked with Mitsuda before on various Xenoblade soundtracks. So there's 2 vocal tracks that I have here from that. The vocals are by Aisling McGlynn, who's one of the singers from Anunia. So the first track is called A Vow of Wind and Dreams, and the second track is called Dreams of the Past, Memories of My Soul. And then the final track is just a rearrangement of the Termina Another World track, and it's just called Termina Another World. very nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, as I say, it's that's a really nice little soundtrack that they just sort of released as a little extra for the Radical Dreamers edition. They had some new arrangements and just those lyrical tracks that were added. One of which is sort of a new track entirely, and the other one then is a rearrangement of one of the town themes. I forget which one exactly. But they're really really nice, and it really sort of emphasizes the Celtic sort of nature of the music itself that Mitsuda was sort of really going after with those tracks. And as I say, it doesn't replace anything in the game. It's just something that when you open up the game and you have the sort of main menu open, it just cycles through these tracks. So like you'll generally not even hear all of them, unless you're quite happy to sit with the menu open, which I wouldn't necessarily blame you either. But these can be found on their own as a separate release. It got a vinyl release along with the game. I never picked that vinyl up. I actually should have, but it's really really good. And again, it's just sort of a nice little tribute to the game without replacing anything in it, because I found that a lot of Square were doing this a lot, or Square Enix have been doing this a lot recently with their re-releases, where they're going in and they're tweaking things, and they're making like the Final Fantasy X soundtrack when they re-released that. There was a lot of people who had problems with that soundtrack, and I personally did prefer the originals. And the Final Fantasy 12 remaster that they did, like they went in and messed around with that soundtrack, often to its detriment. So I'm glad that when they re-released this game, that they left it more or less untouched.
Yeah, it's the fact that the new content and a lot of the effort that was put into the re-release is focused on the soundtrack and on the music feels right. This is something that on my show, on Watch Out for Fireballs, me and my co-host Gary, we kind of limit going back to console RPGs, specifically from the 90s and, around the turn of the century, just because we have mechanical. Yeah, we would do. Yeah, yes. There's so many that people have a lot of, a lot of affection for, but we have mechanical quibbles with them as well. It's just that, like from a play standpoint, the decisions that define that genre just don't work for us very much anymore. But something that we've run across, in talking with people is everybody can agree on the soundtrack.
Yeah.
Right. Like, oh yeah, the music in this game is great, and that's not a reason to go back and play the game. You can listen to the music on its own. It's there. But I think that a not small portion of people's affection for these games and for this era of of RPGs, I think a lot of it is their affection for the music, kind of like taking over and replacing a lot of the memory of actually playing the games. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something we've run across, and I do tend to agree. Like I do struggle to go back and replay, especially RPGs of that era. They can be difficult to sort of to deal with some of their nonsense.
Yeah.
But a lot of the reason I have affection for those games, as flawed as they can be, is the soundtrack, and it's a lot of the reason many of these games have the legacy that they do.
Absolutely.
And like Reese and I talk a lot about it on the podcast, just in general, of like how music can elevate a game and can sort of take it from being something that's great to being something that's truly exceptional. And like I think a soundtrack like this that is full of so many sort of positive memories for me, in terms of just like gameplay and also listening to the soundtrack in and of itself. Like it's really really hard to sort of to decouple my feelings for this game from the soundtrack, and I feel like it wouldn't be worth my while trying to do that untangling either.
Yeah. No, it is impossible to believe that Chrono Cross would have the legacy that it does without the soundtrack kind of anchoring people to it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely.
So yeah, thank you so much, Cole, for joining us. It was really, really good to have you on. Just before we go out, if you'd like to do any plugs, tell people about your very good shows that that I personally have been a list. I mentioned to you at the start, but I've personally been listening to Watch Out for Fireballs more or less since you guys started back in the early 2010s. Oh Jesus, that's a long ass time ago.
That's a very long time ago. Yeah.
I think I started listening in 2012 or so.
Wow.
Yeah.
Seems like I do you have a lot of podcasts or just part of like a podcast network?
Yeah, we do too many podcasts to list them all. I think I lose track. I think we have like 12 shows currently active.
My God.
Not weekly, but it's just, you start one show, you start another. They just kind of grow unchecked. No, I podcast. We have a network called duckfeed.tv. Kind of the primary show, the one that I've alluded to a couple of times here, is called Watch Out for Fireballs. It's a show that I do with Gary Butterfield, my co-host. It is like a book club, but for video games. We've been going since 2011, so we have just a ton of episodes. We're coming up on 500 here pretty soon. 500 full games ish that we've covered in depth. But just go to duckfeed.tv. You'll see the list of shows. We've got a bunch of stuff. Show generally a rotating slot of a show about television. We did one about the Venture Brothers. Now we're doing it about Breaking Bad. Show about horror movies, bunch of stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
I definitely recommend. I forget the name of the horror movie. Unfilmable. Sorry, yeah.
Yes.
Unfilmable. I really like that show, and also have been a Bonfire Side Chat listener since that started too.
Yeah.
Because you guys started that just around the time I started getting into Dark Souls myself.
Nice.
So it's sort of like that was the soundtrack of my first couple of playthroughs of that game.
Nice.
Well, I like horror movies and these Souls games, I should say. I'll check them out.
Yeah. But I really appreciate you guys having me on, especially on to talk about this particular soundtrack.
Of course. Now that we've had you on, we're gonna have you on again.
Yeah,
going to bug you for that, definitely. So Reese, if you want to do your plugs at this point, go ahead.
Check out Video Games Are the Worst Thing on Earth, a video game culture and news podcast coming from a leftist perspective. And also check out Existential Warfare, a personal podcast about finding good in this dog shit world. We just recorded an episode with Conky that's going to be out reasonably soon, talking about 3D printing and how actually it is not a good idea to 3D print guns. That's it. Don't follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky. It's bad. I post bad things.
And as for ourselves, I suppose as always, just patreon.com/CRT Sound System. If you want to support us, you can get some bonus episodes and you can get the regular episodes in a higher bit rate. You can follow me on Blue Sky at 4push. I'm still only on Twitter as the CRT Sound System account, so I never really log into that very often. Come hang on the Discord. The Discord is reasonably active. And we got some good people in there. So if you want to bug somebody to talk about FM synths that they've made themselves, you can, you can talk to some real experts on video game music in there.
Absolutely.
And also you can just have me be mentally ill about Jamiroquai with you if you want as well.
Absolutely. We just made Pepper from Salt and Pepper a sticker. So come check that out.
Yeah. And if you want to come on the show, let me know. I would love, as I say, the show is always about just getting people on to talk about things that they love about video game music. Mm-hmm. So if you, as Reese always says, if you want us to do the Undertale soundtrack, you got to come on the show.
Yeah. We are not equipped as people to do the Undertale soundtrack, but it's kind of our most requested episode. So are you the person? Are you the Undertale fan? Only one way to find out.
To finally break that seal. All right. So yeah, thank you so much again, Cole. It was really fun to have you
Thank
on.
you.
Thank you, Reese, and thank you for
Yeah.
listening. So we're just going to go out with the final track of the game. And it is the true ending theme essentially is Radical Dreamers, the jewel which cannot be stolen. Good night.
私